Our session this evening is on raising the potential and performance of the Scottish economy. We are also looking at whether the recommendations of the Sustainable Growth Commission can deliver on this. We have 3 speakers lined up for you tonight, so please give a warm, if virtual, welcome to George Kerevan, Scottish journalist, economist and politician. George has been deeply involved in the People's Manifesto, advocating for a Scottish economy centred on people rather than. Welcome, George. And next is Dr. Tim Rideout, economist, convener of the Scottish Currency Group and author of Amendment D, proposing Scotland has its own currency and Scottish Central Bank from the outset. So welcome, Tim.
Welcome.
And next, Kairin van Sweeden, Executive Director of the economic think tank Modern Money Scotland, which pursues alternative economic thinking. Kairin is also Lothian Coordinator for the SNP Common Weal Group. Welcome, Kairin. Panel, we only have 30 minutes and my brief is to get through at least 10 questions. So please keep your answers concise and I may use the chair's prerogative to chip you along. If you have nothing to add, just say and we'll move on. And we'd like to hear from the audience. So please, if you've got questions for our panel, use the chat box, start your question with a capital Q so that we can find it, and indicate if your question answered by anyone in particular. So cracking on, Kairin, I'm just going to dive right in. Modern Money Scotland seeks to change the language and debate around economics, developing policies centred around economic well-being. Can you briefly describe your brave new Scotland and its cornerstone policies?
Yeah, we are working on a paper on a job guarantee programme that hopefully will be published really soon. I think one of the most obvious things to make your country function better, and I think we have to stop talking about making Scotland perform. I kind of actually quite resent talking about my country in that way, that it's sort of like a dancing seal. I don't see Scotland as being like a dancing seal. I think Scotland needs some repair and love and care after 40 years of neoliberalism and Tory rule. So yeah, I think, first and foremost, there should be no involuntary unemployment. The government has shown through the furlough scheme that a sovereign government with its own currency can be the employer of last resort. And unemployment has so many toxic effects. And that's the most obvious thing. Then the next most obvious thing is education. Lots and lots of education, caring for our elderly people, caring for our vulnerable people. I think this is what the Scottish people want. I mean, they vote left of centre and they have done for a long time.
Absolutely. And George, the People's Manifesto proposes that the Scottish economy is centred on people rather than profit. What are the key cornerstones necessary for an independent Scotland to deliver in your manifesto, or this manifesto?
Well, there's no great secret in putting people to work. It's the present capitalist system based on profit that stops people working. So what we need is a project to get people working, creating new homes for people, training people to build in a better way, linking those new homes to a green energy project that actually reduces the energy density of the country. We can do this. If there's one thing that's correct in the Growth Commission report, it's the discussion about the levels of investment and productivity. Scotland has a very low level of investment. I think the state can ensure that we up the level of investment and the level of productivity. This is not about abstract growth targets. It's simply about putting people to work to make things that we all need. And that can be done. And the green energy project linked to new housing is the way to do it.
But Kairin, I think you mentioned that neoliberalism, 40 years of neoliberalism. And so I would suggest, having been in the FTSE 100 for 30 of them, that the type of economy that we have it's impossible to deliver on what seems quite simple things that you mentioned. It sounds like Scotland, an independent Scotland, would need control of its monetary, fiscal and economic system to deliver change. And you described the Sustainable Growth Commission recommendation of sterlingisation as a country without a currency is like a carpenter without a saw. Would you like to elaborate on that for me?
Yeah, I mean, a currency, obviously, it's a storage of value, a means of exchange. But it fundamentally is your policy tool. If you're a politician, it is the tool that enables the action of a policy to happen. But it's not the be-all and end-all. I mean, you have to have the real resources to make the policy tool work. So two things have to go together. So, for example, the really obvious example just now is with PPE. It doesn't matter how much money the Bank of England creates for the British government. If the PPE is not in existence, you can't buy it. So resources we have an abundance of. The currency is a policy tool.
Yeah. And Tim, would you like to elaborate on that for me?
Yeah, well, following on from Karen there, the job of the government really is to run the economy by changing and adjusting its spending and its taxing to get as close to full employment as possible. So, if you're well below full employment, it means the government's either taxing too much or it's spending too little, or a bit of both. As you move towards full employment, then you need to reduce the deficit beyond full employment. If inflation starts becoming an issue, then the state should be increasing tax, cutting spending, and running a surplus. So, there are situations where, people say it's always accusing MMT of being about printing money, but it isn't. It's about, managing, using the policy levers to manage the economy to maximize the welfare of society. And, if you have mass unemployment and wasted resources as we do at the moment, means the government's simply not doing its job.
So as soon as practicable after independence, we need our own currency. We also need our own Scottish Central Bank, but presumably not a pretendy one, presumably one that has all the functions that you would expect of a central bank. Is that the case?
Absolutely. And we're already working on the initial designs for the Scottish Reserve Bank. We're hoping that we'll be able to get to the stage where everything's designed and the sort of invitations to tender and so forth for the IT contracts and stuff like that are all ready to just sort of push the button the day after an independence referendum. Okay,
I've got a few questions coming in now. The first one is how, unfortunately, they all come out is from William Thompson because he's the one that's adding them. But so I don't know the names of the individuals asking the questions. But the first one is, how can we know Scotland is performing if we only have the flawed GERS as a data source?
GERS, I'm amazed that anyone takes GERS seriously. I mean, for me, I look at a report that's trying to make a comparison between a currency issuing entity and a non-currency issuing entity. How can you make a comparison between those two entities? And then, in the first couple of pages, there's a couple of tables to talk about Scotland's economy with oil and without oil, so that it's shown a very clear political bias right from the start. I have a science degree. I mean, I'm looking at it thinking, this is nonsense. So it's not a good reference to start off with.
So how do we get the correct data in order to know where we are?
But there has been a debate. I mean, I'm getting, you see, I've lost all my hair. There's been a debate for 50 years about the lack of decent statistical evidence for how the Scottish economy behaves. And before devolution, after devolution, no agency, the Scottish Office or any government since devolution has bothered to actually create a proper statistical agency and do the fact finding. That's one of the key things that the Scottish government could be doing now. No. It takes a bit of an effort, but it could be done. We don't have that. I mean, GERS is what we've got, and it's desperately, woefully inadequate. But actually, if you think we're actually ahead of Wales and Northern Ireland in the data we have, let's get the data on the table.
Sure, Tim.
Yeah, I was just going to add, at the same SNP conference as Amendment D, there was another resolution passed to set up Statistics Scotland. So, it is SNP policy. The government just hasn't done it.
It's conference policy. It doesn't mean to say the government's going to implement conference policy.
Yeah.
If I move on to the 6 tests, if I dare, not only do we not set off with our own currency from the outset, and actually for quite a significant period, but also in order to get our own currency, we've got to satisfy 6 tests, and these have been described as nebulous, irrelevant, and unachievable. And indeed, Tim, I believe that you called the credible central bank test as being a catch-22 test. Can you explain why? What's wrong with these tests, and is it a trap?
They're not addressing the real issues. The real issues are things like, are the new notes and coins ready? Have you designed the central bank properly and got all the, we're going to need something like 350 staff at the point when the currency is launched, rising to 800 in the end. Is that in place? Have we explained to the public what's going to happen and what they have to do, what they don't have to do? These are the things you need to be looking at. Something like, does the currency meet the needs of the people and business? Well, in the 18th century, they used cowrie shells in the South Pacific Islands, and they worked as a currency. So, what sort of test is that one? Equally, something like decoupling from the UK business cycle. That's something we should do, but you have to have your own currency in order to do it. You can't decouple from the UK business cycle if you're allowing London to set all the policies and pull all the levers for you.
And how do you get the Scottish Government to listen? Because these are things that we've spoken about, some of us, for a number of years, perhaps even decades, if you're talking. What can we do in order to get Scottish Government actually to start planning for currency and communications and a Scottish statistical office and the like? Kairin.
Yeah, I should say that I'm also a vested interest. I have. I'm sitting for the northeast of Scotland because I'm in Aberdeen now, not in Edinburgh, on the Policy Development Committee. So I would really like to see a democratic process where the members are involved as much as possible in creating policy, for the moment, but also that we create an offering for the population at large when we come to the referendum, and a credible offering that brings hope and vision.
Absolutely, absolutely. I've got another question that's come in. With the growing need to transition to green energies, how do you propose that we ensure citizens are skilled, or more importantly, reskilled for these emerging industries, keeping in mind that any training may need to occur across generations rather than depending on the young?
Slip in here. I mean, there's a key issue. If the Scottish Government issues a contract, it's in a position to put down various obligations on the companies involved. This is where we failed magnificently when it came to expanding renewable energy in the North Sea. Despite the fact that we own the waves, when we contracted them out to the energy companies, we didn't bother to put in rules like you'll build the technology here, and you'll hire people here, and you'll train people here. Now we should do that. It's very simple. It's not rocket science, and we should be doing that for a big housing expansion, and we should also be building in contracts into those contracts in terms of use of renewables, the quality of the housing, etc., etc., etc. So it's government will. It's nothing else required, but we don't do it, which is why after being told 10 years ago that there would be this great bonanza of jobs in the North Sea from renewable energy, it never happened. All the jobs went overseas, and I have to say that's at the door of the present SNP government.
Yeah, I was actually involved in that, working in SSE actually, and one of the issues was the being ready in time in some respects, proven technologies that Scotland didn't have, the UK didn't have proven technologies for some of these bigger wind turbines. And had we acted earlier, we may well have done, but the technologies had to be proven for the insurance companies, and everything went, as you say, went overseas, principally to Denmark and Germany. Going back to the central bank, I've got another question here. How long does it take to set up a central bank and what are the precedents? And that's a question for Tim.
The latest estimate I've got, now we've got much more detailed plans, is it will take about 4 years from starting, which, you know, with the preliminaries, we're intending to start in May this year, because that's all. There's a whole load of stuff in design and so forth, which really doesn't require either the Scottish Government support or much expenditure. So we can you know, spend the time between now and the referendum getting everything ready to, you know, so it's designed and we have you know, the documentation and so forth. And then once we win the vote, the Scottish Government can take it over and push the buttons, and then there will be some serious costs after that.
Well, talking about having our own bank, can I turn to financial regulation? The QC that was tasked the banks post the financial crisis said that the regulator was operating in a world where enforcement against bankers had become a virtual impossibility. George Osborne would, of course, later force out the chief regulator for trying to introduce regulation to the banks. Despite this, the Growth Commission recommends that Scotland grandfathers the UK's light touch regulatory regime. Is this wise? And if not, what should replace it?
You need to have regulation.
Funny that. The clue's in the name, isn't it? The clue's in the name.
Can I just say, I was on the Treasury Committee, UK Treasury Committee, which is the ultimate oversight over the regulators, doing Bank of England, PRC and so on. And I got to know the senior regulators very well, including Andrew Bailey, who is now head of the Bank of England. And I wrote a very detailed paper on regulation based on the discussions and the work I'd done at the Treasury Select Committee. And that went to the Sustainable Growth Commission and disappeared and was never discussed. And I've never been able to track down why that ceased to be an issue. The regulatory structures that we have at the moment were reinforced after the 2008 debacle. But essentially the ideas that were brought in 2008-10 were worn down by the banks themselves and by the phalanx of PR people they have. If you work in the House of Commons, you will discover that most of the people there working there are PR people and communication staff for big companies, particularly the banks. And if you go down to the lobby where all the restaurants are at lunchtime, you'll see all the banks have lunches every day and breakfast and dinners. And they have this huge PR operation going on. And so all the regulatory improvements that were supposed to be introduced post-2008 were simply eliminated. And so the regulatory regime, if anything, is worse than it was, weaker than it was prior to 2008. So probably at this stage, we need to try and catch up. But there are lots of things that we could do. But particularly, we have to have a system whereby the banks that operate in Scotland are licensed in Scotland, are subject to Scottish regulation. And I think that might be the first stage to try and create a regime where we can control what the banks do. Bottom line, let's just nationalise the buggers.
Well, if we go on to corporate, so my background is corporate governance. If we go on to to corporates, and obviously we've got a comply or explain system in terms of the model code. We also have a situation where shareholders, it was only the 2006 Act, so I'm interested in what you're saying, that regulation's worse than it was, because corporate governance is worse than it was when I started my career 25 years ago. And in 2006, they introduced shareholder primacy, where you have to put shareholders' interests above everyone and everything else, which includes customers, employees, the environment, and society at large. And how can we, if these engines of growth and employment, how can we deliver, when that is the priority? Because it pervades every single recommendation made in every single board paper. It changes the whole culture. So what what type of model should we have for companies?
We need more the German system with things like a supervisory board representing the workforce and so forth. Obviously, the first thing we can throw out is what you just said about the shareholders being the only people that need to be considered. So obviously that shouldn't be the case. So there'll be quite a lot of things you could change about the way companies work. I know Richard Murphy, who's going to be talking a bit later, he has a lot of ideas about the stakeholders in companies, and that's things like not just the workforce, but the wider community, the customers, the environment. They all need to be considered.
The suppliers as well. Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to go back to another question. Sorry, Kairin, please come in.
I just wanted to say I listened to an interesting podcast by Mark Blythe, and he was talking about how the workers in the car factories in Northern England, when they were being interviewed by the BBC, I think it was, they said something like, this voting for Brexit, don't you see that that's a bad thing for GDP? And the guy in the car factory said, your GDP. That says it all. The car factories are threatening the workers all the time. We're going to move. So the people in the car factories voted for Brexit because they don't have empowerment, and it's really toxic for society. And going back to the thing about borrowing from the banks, I mean, I personally wouldn't go to a bank for a loan because I just regard them as cowboys now.
Does somebody want to take up a question about deficit?
I'll so, I mean, you have to think about what the government deficit is, in that the government spends more than it receives in taxation. So that gives it a deficit. And, we've been sold the idea that deficits are bad and so forth. But it's a double entry accounting system. So if one person has a deficit, somebody else has a surplus. And in the case of the state, there's two parts to the economy. There's the private sector and the public sector. So if the public sector has a deficit, it means the private sector has a surplus, which means that when I get to the end of the month, I've got a little bit of my wage left and I can put that in savings. If the government runs a surplus, which is what the Tories would like, that means the private sector has a deficit. So I'm £100 short at the end of the month and I have to put it on my credit card and then pay the interest to some Tory who owns the credit card company. So, that's the difference. What you really want is that the state carries the economy. It supports the economy by its spending and tax policies. It runs a deficit most of the time because that's what keeps us at full employment, and that allows the private sector to achieve what it wants, which is to be able to buy the things it needs and have a bit of money left. So a deficit, the deficit for Scotland is not, it's not a bad thing at all. If it is 15 billion in the first year or two of independence, that would be because we're employing 40,000 new civil servants. We're building ministries all over the place, doing the IT systems, so forth. So that's all an investment in the economy. It provides contracts for companies all over the country. Half of that money goes back to the government in extra tax anyway. So in due course, as the economy grows with a post-independence boom, the deficit will cure itself, as tax revenues will go up and the government won't need to spend so much. So, it's really not an issue.
Kairin, your website had a cool wee video on this.
Yeah, I was just going to say the really simple answer is that the government spends first and taxes second. And I think that most people think it's the other way around. The businesses provide currency for the government, but the government is the monopoly issuer of the currency. It's a simple monopoly, and it is the in charge of it. So it spends first, it taxes second, and it's good that we've got a deficit, because if we didn't have a deficit, we'd all have to borrow from our commercial banks to buy our messages. We don't want to do that.
Yeah, listen, most people watching here have got a deficit. They've got a mortgage to buy their house. And you borrow, 3-4 times your income, whereas the British government, we're all getting panicky because the British government's got a deficit which is roughly the same as GDP. I used to have some wonderful conversations with George Osborne, who didn't really know anything about economics. Was very superficial. So I kept saying to him, "You trying to reduce the deficit to zero? So if that means you don't want the government to borrow anything, if the government doesn't borrow anything, what are pension funds going to invest in? If they can't invest here with government securities, they'll have to go and borrow somewhere else abroad, which will be highly risky. Don't you understand how dumb it is if you don't borrow anything? You never quite got it.
I've got another question here is, what is the panel's thoughts on digital currencies?
Yeah,
Kairin.
well, yeah, Bitcoin. Again, you can't pay your taxes and you can't spend it in Tesco. So yeah, it's you know, I'm not against creation of currencies, and I used to be involved in the transition time movement, and Totnes and Devon and Lewis and Sussex are doing that. You can create currencies, it's getting them accepted. That's the thing, and fundamentally our government's currency is valuable because they tax us in it. It has a coercive element to it. So yeah, Bitcoin, you know, it's got limited value. It's like a voucher. You can share it between chosen people, but again, they're not democratically elected. So you really would prefer to have your currency coming from a body that's democratically elected.
Excellent. I've got another question for Tim here, and that is, could you quickly, step by step, take us through the process for setting up a central bank, please?
Well, we actually have a 5-phase implementation plan. So phases 1 and 2 can be done before a referendum, but those are sort of you know, the initial planning, you know, coming up with the specifications, devising the tenders for creating the communication networks and so forth. After, you know, you get to stage 3, that's where you're actually doing things like, you know, talking to the commercial banks about how they're going to interface with the central bank, commissioning contracts for things like the design of notes and coins, and you know, getting a serious number of staff on board with in the new premises and so forth. And the bank also needs information systems to provide information on how the economy is doing in order to be able to set monetary policy correctly. So you know, there's quite a complicated process, but you know, fundamentally, you know, you could maybe simplify it by saying that you've got design, commissioning for the projects which are necessary to be done, then testing, and then finally implementation with the launch of the currency.
Excellent. And where would you like the central bank to be located?
Well, personally, I think it should have its headquarters in the old Royal High School building on Carlton Hill, because it's currently empty. It's got a nice Greek-style portico, so when the Scottish Broadcasting Corporation is doing a bit about monetary policy or a change in interest rates or something, they can stand with the nice pillars in the background. You know, but in case anyone gets the wrong message, I'm not suggesting that all the new ministries should be in Edinburgh. The central bank, I think, is about the finance ministry and the central bank are the only things I would put in Edinburgh. So other ministries, like say Ministry of Energy, I'd put it in Aberdeen. You know, Ministry of Agriculture, put it in Dumfries. You know, Ministry of Business and Enterprise, put it in Glasgow. You know, you put the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Stirling or something. You know, you divide it all up around the country. Fisheries in Shetland, obviously. You put the Coast Guard in Stornoway. So everyone can get an advantage from independence. Everyone can see that there's going to be, you know, jobs and contracts and whatever in their local area, and that they might benefit from.
I might be able to squeeze a related question in there, and it's about regional economic development, which the Commission virtually didn't touch on. Do you think they could have used better examples, perhaps Germany, where decision making is devolved to the regions, where there's a focus on SMEs and family enterprises, and where economic and social development are inextricably linked? Does anyone want to pick up on regional development, and can we do it better? George?
Yeah, I'd slightly twist it, because actually so many of us live in towns, and one of the interesting features of how Scotland is constructed is that a lot of us live in quite small towns, unlike England. I think they're pushing back taxation, spending, decision making to the town level, the municipal level, is very important, because there's a whole other sector about rural and islands and so on. Absolutely the same thing goes, but we need to move decision making out of Edinburgh on a very systematic level.
So could we have an open social stock exchange?
No, I think we should abolish private ownership of the means of production, but I'm an old-fashioned socialist.
And just very quickly, was there anything that you liked within the Scottish Growth Commission report at all? Did anyone find any redeeming features?
I think they're correct in saying that we should be encouraging, immigration to Scotland.
Yeah,
and I would say we should try it. We should do like the Irish did and have a come home policy. That for the 700,000 people born in Scotland who live in the rest of the UK, like all my neighbours in S-Bank, their children moved to London. So let's have some of those people come home and build a better Scotland along with us.
Kairin?
Yeah, and the other thing as well is, with actually being independent, you would have the power to say, for example, we have a lot of underutilization of people in our economy as well. I mean, I know of at least one person with a PhD that works in a supermarket and another one with a master's in astrophysics that works in a bookshop. So we need to pull these people out of these jobs and get them doing higher value things in our economy.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I have now a few seconds, I believe, in which to summarise. I don't think anybody really thought an awful lot of the Scottish Growth Commission report. I would agree with it. I chucked it in the general direction of the bin, having read it. I think that we do need wholesale change. That's what the panel is agreeing, that we need wholesale change, that we need control of our monetary, fiscal and economic system. We need our own central bank and we need our own currency. And we need to develop a well-being economy that benefits our citizens, putting people before profit. So hopefully that summarises tonight's discussion, and I have ended on time. Thank you so much, all of you. I really do appreciate it, and for educating me, on economics and the bold, beautiful new future for Scotland. Thank you very much.